So he got his Bachelor's of Science in Biology, continued on for a Master's in Biology, and he got his PhD in Pharmacology and Toxicology, and then went on to become a Doctor of Veterinary Medicine. So he's actually a licensed vet in Wisconsin and Alaska, right? So he works with Native communities in Alaska, and we're really glad to be able to host you this week. I think besides all your academic accomplishments, I feel like it's safe to say you're just a good person, and it's been great to have you around this week, and thank you for sharing your information with our students and our community.
Good,
That's Todd.
So you got that good person on video, right? All right, awesome. That's going to be recorded. So I'd like to thank the college for arranging for me to come down and visit with students and faculty. And I know Dr. Stevens couldn't make it, but we had a long visit, and so we covered a lot of things. And so I'd like to thank Doug and Amy for making all the arrangements. Very, very hospitable. And oh my gosh, gorgeous country. So you can imagine coming from Alaska that I feel like I'm at home. It wasn't quite cold enough. But apparently it's cold enough for you guys. Yeah, everywhere I go, oh, it's so cold. Yeah, it is for you guys, but for us, this is beautiful weather, and you guys live in a gorgeous place. So I'm going to just review some of the things that we do, and just so you know, this is a very student-centric presentation because I'm trying to encourage you to go on with your education and also encourage you to recognize opportunities in Alaska between your region here in western Montana and us in Alaska. And you've had visitors before from Alaska, and so I think you get to see a theme that we're really excited about forming a relationship. So I hope you recognize it's legitimate, and we're really excited about some of the things we're discussing. So I'm going to talk about who I am. In Alaska, when Alaska Natives introduce themselves, it's very important they talk about their family first, not themselves. And I'm guessing that's important in a lot of indigenous peoples outside or lower 48. Sorry, Alaska thinks it's different, and it is. So my father and mother were from central Ohio, and we were farming families. I'm now married to Carla Oletto, who is Navajo and Danish. She's my Navajo Danish, is what I call her. We have 2 children, Lars Josef O'Hara and Anna Kirsten O'Hara. As you can see, they gave them Danish names to go with my Irish name, which sounds a little strange. So I'm the father of teenagers, which probably is more challenging than anything I do academically. But I love my kids, and they're great. Just to give you some pictures of my heritage and why I feel like I'm close to the earth. I came from farming families, and we also depended on wildlife and fish. So it was agriculture, we hunted, and we fished. And so I feel like my family was very in touch with the land. Unfortunately, Columbus, Ohio took over this farm, and this is all housing. I'm sure there's parts of Montana that are like that too, where great agricultural wildlife and fishing areas have been taken over by urban areas. It's something we struggle with, I think. And so, but this is part of my heritage and part of my passion for what I do. There was a lot in between. I survived a lot of juvenile things and went to college, as Amy introduced. But this is what we're doing in Fairbanks now. And here we are celebrating Christmas with our laboratory and family. And I put that in there because when people ask professional and personal things and how do you balance your life? Well, I've integrated my work life with my personal life. My family goes in the field with me on research. As you can see, they come to the house and we enjoy dinner together. And so I don't see a distinct line. Now, for some people in their life balance, they have to have that line. But for us, the family decided we were going to integrate our work and our passion for what we do with our life. And, oh, you gave me a pointer. Thank you. Thanks, Jesse. So that's that, the group there. Just want to point that out to you, that you can enjoy your work and your life in this manner if you like. This is my wife. She has the best job on campus. I have the second best job. This is a reindeer calf, and you can go, aw. Aw. So she gets to work with all the lab animals at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And when I say lab animal, that includes the muskox, the caribou, the reindeer, the black bears, the brown bears, the Arctic ground squirrels, the redback voles. I think you get the point, right? In Alaska, when we say lab animal, it means mice, rats, and all those other things. Jesse's been there. He knows about this. That's a lab animal, believe it or not. So, but these are my kids in the early days. Just loving Alaska. This probably brings back some memories to Jesse that it's okay to see in your driveway, but not on the highway. Okay? So this is a moose at the top of our driveway. My mom once said, "You live in a postcard." And I think you do too. You need to cherish that. The people come here just to look at your mountains, right? And people fly to Fairbanks to see our scenery and wildlife. And so I just want to remind myself of that every now and then, that I get to live in a postcard. And then just so that you know, they show up in numbers. This is the bottom of the driveway. That's my kids, embracing a dead thing. We're always posing with all kinds of stuff in Alaska. That's a caribou, or what's left of a caribou. And here's my wife out on polar bear immobilizations. Where's Frank? There you go. What do you think of that? All right. No, he's into polar bears, obviously, so that's why I wanted to point that out. So we were involved in polar bear research for a long time, and my wife went out and helped chemically immobilize these animals. So it's a lot of fun in Alaska. And some of the points I've been trying to make on this trip is, in some parts of the world, you have to justify working on fish or justify working on wildlife because people expect you to work on agricultural species or humans, right? In Alaska, I have never had to justify what I work on. And so my point is, when we talk about One Health, it's integrated into the culture. They're seen as valuable inherently. You don't have to go to some commission or politician and convince them that they're important. That's one thing I love about Alaska, is there's no one who will question the importance of these animals and their relationships with people. Jesse went to UAF, and I think you would appreciate that, right? That's one thing about Alaska. And I think parts of Montana are probably like that. First fish, it's always a big deal. Kind of on the animal welfare front, that's a bit of a grip. He handles them a little better now if they're going to be released. And then sled dogs are really important, and we adopt retired sled dogs, and boy, they're fun. They're cool animals. So now, this is nothing new to you, but when I would go to Mexico or San Diego, this just stuns people. There's my son. We're going for pike in George Lake, which is near us. And then, so what I'm trying to get at here is winter sports. He skis, he fishes, all that. And then my daughter, this is curling. She's a competitive curler. Anybody following the curling in the Olympics? Yes, the U.S. is doing great. We beat Canada. Yes, the men's team beat Canada. I'll be getting too excited now, because when I go home, my daughter's going to be like, we beat Canada. By the way, Canada's the best in the world, and the U.S. beat Canada, so that was a big, big deal. But you guys get this. You're here, winter sports, right? We live through the winter. Most people think we go into hibernation or something. It's like, why would you do that? This is the best time of year. No mosquitoes, right? Yeah, you guys know that, yeah. So Amy went over this, and I'm glad she did. I would have continued in school if I could. I loved school. I mean, I love learning, and so curious. But I want to make this point to the students. Education has opened up many doors for me and my family. There's opportunities out there that I get because of my education that makes my family better. And I think this is really important to emphasize. It's not just about you, but it can be for your community and your family, that education really can do things. So we feel very fortunate. Without this education, these opportunities never would have been available to us. And so we're a very happy family. And my grandparents and parents emphasized education. By the way, my grandparents were not college educated. All four of them. None of them. totally farm raised, nothing about going to college. If they got a high school diploma, that was a big deal. So what I'm trying to get at is that my family emphasized this along with what I mentioned about farms and appreciation for the outdoors. So what's the best thing about going to school? Well, for me, it was my wife. Okay. So here again, that personal, professional thing. Like I met the most incredible person in my life in vet school, and I was lucky that after about 3 years of pestering her, she married me. So here's what I do as a professor, but I'm also coordinator of student services and pre-vet advisor. We have a 2+2 program training veterinarians with Colorado State University. So we've expanded our educational base by having now vet students on campus, along with graduate students. Graduate students were always there. So we now have this relationship with Colorado State University. So we're training veterinarians. Not that I want to steal people from Montana who want to become veterinarians, but if a student was interested in coming to UAF and getting residency at the University of Alaska Fairbanks in the state of Alaska, you would be eligible to become a veterinarian through this program. So I'm just pointing that out, that we are now able to take Alaska residents and put them into this program at Colorado State to become veterinarians. Montana has similar relationships with vet schools, what I understand. And so this is what I'm trying to get at, is that there's multiple ways to get to these biomedical careers. I've been at UAF for a while. This is mostly for the faculty who are out there like, well, what do you actually do? I don't know if many of you know, the students, that we have these workloads. So I basically say I'm 1/3 research, 1/3 teaching, and 1/3 administration. So if the faculty out there are wondering how we balance our workloads, this is the fantasy world that my administrator lives in. I can tell you that it's a little different based on the time of year. I think most faculty know that. So if you're a student interested in becoming a professor, recognize this is over a year. You might spend a semester focused on teaching, and then another semester maybe focused on, oh wait, you're in quarters. You might focus on 1 or 2 quarters of teaching, and then the other quarters might be for research. So when we talk about life balance, this is also a part of that. I don't do this evenly every week, but I think an academic career is really interesting, and some people stick with just this. I have a colleague I work with, 90% research is her appointment. So as far as becoming someone in academia, you can choose how you balance this with respect to negotiating with the university you're at. I worked in Barrow, which is now Utqiagvik. They changed their name. So I've lived in a native community, the farthest north native community. If you go any further, you're wet. You're in the Arctic Ocean. Okay, Barrow is the farthest north you can go in Alaska. We've loved every frigid minute. People always say, oh, how can you live there? And this really is not a factor. I mean, you just enjoy life at -40 or +30, I guess. When you get too warm, everything melts. So research interests, it's the one health thing we're going to talk about, animal health and human health. We're really interested in nutrients and contaminants with some work in infectious agents. The animal models we use are listed here. I don't need to necessarily read those off to you. But most recently, I have become a mosquito veterinarian. Yep. Why? They are flying syringes. They're going around the environment sampling animals for us. They're cheaper than graduate students. Okay? So what we do is they've invented these CO2 traps, the mosquito magnets, right? Very effective. And so what we do is we capture mosquitoes at various locations and we monitor them because they're taking these blood meals. We monitor them for infectious agents in the wildlife. And we've also put them next to dog kennels. And we tell the musher, you might want to check your dogs. And so there's a variety of diseases we're monitoring for. The main one we're monitoring for is tularemia. I don't know if that rings any bells here. Some people know it as rabbit fever. It's the one that people who skin rabbits get if they're not careful. But it's also a weaponized bacteria. No, you guys know about weaponized, right? Like some microorganisms get weaponized. This is one where we're not allowed to grow it because the U.S. and Russia developed it as a weapon. Okay, so in other words, it's a serious disease. And so we use the mosquitoes to monitor for it. So I get to work with amazing animals, including mosquitoes. So the point here is this research has taken me around the Arctic, and it's taken me up and down the entire west coast of North America, because we're now doing some of this work in Mexico. And so if you're interested in being internationally relevant in your work, I would say that these kind of opportunities are out there, and they're very exciting. This is what I teach, or this is what I try to teach. So here's what I teach to the vet students. Here's what I teach to the undergraduates. And so again, it's an honor and privilege because we get paid to learn. I don't know if all the faculty here feel that way, but I learn from preparing for lectures, and then I learn from the students when I interact with them, because they usually ask very challenging questions, and sometimes I don't have the answer, or it's an answer I'm afraid to give, right? Like, I don't know. So I think teaching is something that people don't realize is a two-way street. It's not, the knowledge isn't always just going this way. It's going both ways, and that's very exciting to me. So we've been asked to do health assessments of animals to address food safety. So I'm applying my veterinarian training along with my PhD training and my agricultural background. Well, what in the world do I mean by this? Well, I was asked by the Inupiaq, the people who live in northern Alaska, they're Inuit. They said, we want to know if our animals are healthy, and we want to know if they're healthy to eat. There are very few people that ask questions like that. So I was asked to do health assessments of these animals. Well, when we went in, there was no textbook on, here is the normal bowhead whale. Like, how does a normal bowhead whale appear? What's its chemistry? What's its biochemistry? What's its physiology? So we started doing this with bowhead whales, and we had to describe what was normal before we could describe what was abnormal. Does that make sense? So they were very interested in the health of the animal because they want them to be around forever, right? And they also want them to be healthy so that they know that's a good food item. Well, then we were asked to do the same thing in polar bears. We had to do the foundational work on some of our polar bear populations. How do you describe a healthy polar bear? That was kind of neat to be able to do as a veterinarian and to put it into a research context. So I felt like I was really applying my training to some very progressive ideas that it was the Alaska Natives that asked us to do it. So that was very important to them. I often think of this as sort of like a Ducks Unlimited perspective, where a hunting organization turns out to be one of the strongest conservation groups, right? Yeah, and so that was very powerful for us, that the hunters were the most concerned about the populations. So this is what we're getting at: healthy animals, healthy foods, healthy people and communities. I'm sorry to say I wouldn't put Subway here. I'm sorry. I went to 4Bs last night too. I wouldn't put 4Bs here. I would promote fish and things like that, okay? And things that we actively harvest, right? Because then you exercise harvesting, right? Whether it's plants or animals. This is what's important about this, is they're actively harvesting. So it's culturally important, it has exercise, and the nutrients are really important. So what do we got going on over here? My friend Craig George, an awesome wildlife biologist, took a picture of this because he said, oh my gosh, this is like the ultimate Inuit Atkins diet, if you kind of ignore this thing here. So this is bowhead whale, muktuk. So this is epidermis and blubber. It's called muktuk. This is bowhead mussel, steak. And then this is caribou. Isn't that beautiful? And he was like, oh my gosh, look at this. So he took a picture of it. We've been using it ever since. Because I'm Irish, we included the potato. It's a potato. So I always say, well, I had to include the potato because of my heritage. But I think you see what I'm getting at is that these are healthy fats and high protein, right? So this is the kind of diet that supports healthy people in Alaska. Oh, in more southern parts of Alaska, we'd probably put a fish here and a seal. because they don't have bowhead whales down there. So what do we do this? How do we communicate this? Well, this is what I'd like to do here, hopefully at some point, or have people go to Sitka from here to see us do it. That's something I discussed with Dr. Stevens, is we do One Health necropsy workshops where we get a critter. This is a porpoise. This is a harbor seal. And what we do in this case is this was a stranded animal, and the federal agency said, go ahead and necropsy the animal as outreach. These are students from Mount Edgecombe High School in Sitka. And they come from about 20 to 25 rural native villages from around Alaska. And they're all at one high school. And so we can reach numerous communities this way through the high school students. And so I will do a One Health necropsy where I relate this animal and its adaptations to the environment. I relate that environment and the health of this animal to their health. As a sentinel saying, if this animal's healthy, the environment might be healthy. If this animal's healthy, it would be a healthy food source for you. So that's why we call it a One Health necropsy workshop. We also do these with fish. And so this has really worked well. And it's a great way of outreach to people who depend on marine mammals and fish for a variety of reasons. In this case, this was a hunter-killed animal, and here's the hunter. So we're actually butchering and educating. So he's talking about subsistence use, and I'm talking about science, and we're side by side. The entire school was given the day off to participate in this. So first grade through 12th grade. So there were students all around. It's a basketball court we're on. We're on a basketball court, and we had about 3 of these going at a time. The anthropologist I was working with started crying, and I was worried. And I went over and said, well, why are you crying? I said, have we done something wrong? She goes, no, I've never seen a hunter and a scientist standing next to one another talking about the animal with kids. She was really moved. And so that's what we're trying to say, is we're integrating our teaching of science with the community and its values. And that's what's going on here. That's what's going on here. And again, when I said I learn a lot, it's amazing how much I learn in these interactions, especially from a hunter. So this is something we really, really promote and like. And we just did this down in Mexico with fish. A grad student and I just went down to Mexico and did a similar thing. So we'd like to develop a relationship where maybe some of the students get to go to Sitka as a part of a tribal college exchange, or we could come here and do something. So when we're talking about One Health, this is what we're saying, is that human health, animal health, and environmental health are integrated. This is often what you see when people talk about One Health, and I've been a little discouraged because socioeconomic factors are actually probably more important. Culture, money. So we need to appreciate the socioeconomic factors too that drive all this. And so this is how we want to think about One Health. And I think I fit in best here as a veterinarian. I fit in here best as a scientist. I work with physicians and epidemiologists. This is where we're weak when it comes to policy, politics. And this is where I think we need to grow a little bit more, frankly. So you could talk about tribal issues here. So this is what we're trying to develop more of. That's why we call it One Health. From a marine perspective, I realize you guys are kind of far from the ocean, but you kind of have a really cool ocean right up there. I love Flathead Lake. Oh man, I want to get my hands on that. That looks like a beautiful ecosystem. Oh my gosh. So you could put Freshwater Lake or Flathead. Is it Flathead Lake? Okay, Flathead Lake in there. So you have your environmental drivers. So pH, temperature, nutrients. Nutrients, too many nutrients, is that good or bad? Bad, right. So more nutrients isn't always a good thing. So it's got to be balanced. Environmental agents of disease. I put in some bacteria there for some of our friends in the audience. And mercury, of course, because I think you guys do a little bit of mercury work here. So these things, the environmental agents of disease. then host populations. Obviously, I talked a little bit about that already, that my job in Alaska was to evaluate these. And so these all interact. And remember, there's the biotic and abiotic components that we have to consider. So this is another way of looking at it. Maybe that they really don't get along that well. Somebody got a little too, love, peace, harmony. No, I've actually never seen that. This I've seen and this I've seen. But again, this is absence that socioeconomic thing, but you kind of get the idea that these are involved and integrated. So this is what we do in our lab, the wildlife toxicology lab. We do our research in a One Health context. Amy said that during the introduction. I think it's pretty obvious, subsistence diets. I explained that a little bit already. I think that's pretty obvious. Wildlife as an indicator of human risk, we call them sentinels. Right now we're studying stellar sea lions. We got about $2 million to study stellar sea lions across the Aleutian Islands through the Gulf of Alaska. Oh, yeah, that's right. You guys blow your hot air around. Yeah. Yeah, we circulate it in liquids. Sorry, it's a little disruptive for me. Yeah, so we use them as sentinels of the ecosystem, like what are they exposed to? Infectious agents, contaminants. And by monitoring them, we've actually found some what we would call hotspots. It's like, wow, we never expected mercury to be there at a 10-fold higher concentration. What's going on? Or why are these animals suddenly showing up with antibodies to this pathogen? Why is their population exposed? And so we call them indicators, and they can be indicators of human risk because we share the environment with them. Wildlife as model for humans, that's more basic science oriented at UAF. Here I like to use the example of the Arctic ground squirrel, where hopefully you'll believe me because I'm a scientist and I usually deal in facts. The Arctic ground squirrel, when it hibernates, its body temperature goes to -2 Celsius. Okay, has anybody got physics or chemistry right now? Is that below the freezing point of water? Yeah. They go below the freezing point of water. That is absolutely fascinating. You pick them up and they're like, they're stiff. So it's so fascinating. I'm going to tell you a story because I was encouraged to tell stories, right? I'm not quite an elder yet, so my stories aren't really elder-based. Maybe someday. A graduate student was very disappointed because one of his ground squirrels had died. And they get really close to their animals, and he was upset because the animal died, and it was a subject that he had hoped to finish the project. So he submitted it to the veterinarians, and my wife's one of the veterinarians. And so submitted it for necropsy, and my wife's very deliberate. So she laid the animal out, spread him out. She was getting all her tools ready, and because you have to worry about infectious disease, she was sterilizing her tools. Right? Scalpel blades, forceps, they all have to be heated and sterilized. So, this is on the record, isn't it? Yeah, this is actually one of the true stories I tell, yeah. That was a joke. So she turns around and she's getting ready to perform her necropsy. The ground squirrel breathed, took a breath. My wife's awesome. She's so composed. She just put all the tools back and picked the ground squirrel. Called the graduate student and said, "You should come back and get your squirrel." Why? Well, because it just took a breath. And he runs back. He's like, "What?" That's how -2 and how their physiology slows down. He monitored it and could have swore it had stopped breathing and its heart had stopped. So that's, to me, is amazing human animal model. So that phenomena alone is interesting. However, National Science Foundation, and National Institutes of Health fund these animal models because they have implications for soldiers who are traumatized in the field, has organ transplant implications, recovery from stroke and heart attack. So we're funded by biomedical agencies because understanding this may actually improve human health. Does everybody follow why that would improve human health? If you could stimulate hibernation in a soldier who's been seriously injured, you will give them more time to get to the appropriate care. Okay, car accidents, same thing. So I like telling that story because we often don't think about that in One Health because we're always talking about eating animals. It's more than that. We actually have really cool animal models that are going to help us. We call them extreme adapters. And they show us the physiological limitations that mammals can go to. And that will help us in understanding physiology. Pretty cool stuff. So as I said, I feel like science and policy together are often not well represented in One Health. And so I want to point out government and culture here. And you'll see I put in government here, state, tribal, local interactions. In Alaska, tribal, local interactions are really important, especially in co-management. Many of the marine mammals in Alaska are co-managed. That means Alaska natives are at the table with the federal agencies managing marine mammal species. And that has greatly enhanced the quality of the management, in my opinion. Traditional knowledge is really important. People value these things in different ways. We're currently training One Health practitioners, and the title of John's thesis was One Health Toxicology. So if any of you are interested in this kind of work, there's a lot of programs now emphasizing One Health training. I've been looking at programs that are actually giving One Health degrees now. They're actually training people in One Health. So this is more than just a paradigm or a way of thinking. It's actually becoming a curriculum and a way of doing research. So pretty exciting stuff. Oh, finally, the Arctic. Okay. So why would we be studying contaminants in the Arctic? Because it's so far, far away from sources of contaminants. Yeah, they thought that until the 1960s when they started looking at Antarctica and the Arctic. Turns out things transport long distances in the atmosphere and in the ocean. This includes biotransport. That's why we work with people in Mexico, because we share species. We share waterfowl, we share whales, we share pinnipeds. Animals come up to the Arctic to feed, and they come back down to Mexico to give birth to calves, like gray whales. So we are connected with southern latitudes. So got to remember, a lot of this stuff can be transported to where we're at. So we study the food webs there, and what we have here is we're talking about fish-based food webs, mostly that transport the contaminants we're interested in. So here would be a fish-based food web. They're all reliant on the invertebrates, so shrimp and krill, clams. So again, the polar bear is in our story because he eats about everything that's at the top. Yeah, they'll scavenge bowheads. Frank and I were just talking about that. So they're scavengers and hunters, so they integrate the entire system. But we're interested in how contaminants and nutrients flow through here. I keep saying nutrients. Vitamin D is an important story. Do I have time for another story? I don't know when we have to adjourn.
Well, we go until 1:30, and it's 1:14.
Okay.
I don't know how many slides you have left.
Not many. Well, we'll save that story for later about vitamin D, but it's an interesting one. That's One Health. Well, I'll tell it real quick. So what we've documented in Alaska natives in certain part of Alaska is they're vitamin D deficient because they've gotten away from their fish-based diets. When I was working in Barrow, I got contacted by the Denver Zoo because their polar bear cubs had developed rickets and they wanted to figure out why. Well, what they had done was someone who didn't know any better had taken the cod liver oil out of the formula for the cubs and replaced it with another oil. Oops. That oil was not vitamin D rich that they replaced it with. And they developed rickets in the polar bear cubs. I'm trying to give you a One Health story here, see? If the animals and the people get away from their fish-based diets, they will be deficient in vitamins. It's not just about transport of contaminants. Their nutrition very much depends on this. So we're trying to encourage people to maintain their fish consumption in Alaska because we've documented this. And then it relates to diabetes. Their A1C levels go up. Hopefully I told that quickly enough. So what we also like about this is many of the contaminants, like mercury, actually mimic nutrients. They hitch a ride on an amino acid, and they mimic other amino acids. So you need to know your physiology and your biochemistry, because the contaminants just don't get in there. They're doing something to mimic physiology or biochemistry for transport and their adverse effects. So most people forget about this, that mercury can ride on, methyl mercury can ride on amino acids. This is something Jesse understands, I'm sure, but he's looking at PCBs. They love fat, and so, boy, the Arctic loves fat. Everything's fat in the Arctic. The little krill are full of fat, and all that just goes up the food web, and we have fat bears, fat whales, fat seals, and fat, healthy people. It's the good fat. Remember, there's good fats out there. These are the omega-3s, not the other fats. So lipophilic, they love fat. We also call them hydrophobic. You probably get some of this in your chemistry class about the behavior of these chemicals. They just don't dissolve well in water. So they move into fat, adipose, and the brain. Brain is loaded with lipids, so we are fatheads. So if someone calls you a fathead, it's a compliment. Oh, I just realized. Oh my God, I'm sorry about that. Flathead. Sorry. I should have been aware of that. Sorry. I'm saying fathead.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So the physical chemistry of the agents are really important. So it's not always the complicated nutrition, it's how they partition between water and fats sometimes. So it's not always fancy biochemistry. Others mimic essential elements. Lead likes to mimic calcium. Cesium, radioactive cesium, likes to mimic potassium. We have to study this in the Arctic as well because radioisotopes come to the Arctic, and we always are worried about cesium in our caribou. So recognize that a lot of mimicry going on here with the contaminants. So we come back to our food web. I mentioned this to you already. I plugged in the salmon because they're the best. But in Alaska, all this stuff reaches humans. So marine mammals and people, it's really important for us. That's something you probably don't think about down here. But people in Alaska eat fish and marine mammals. And so important nutrients and very important sociocultural value. So I think what I'll do is pass over this and talk about blood-soaked filter paper because this is something we're using that might be of interest to people here doing the chemistry. We take filter paper. These are the kits we send out in the field to the hunters and the biologists. And then we soak them in blood because it's hard to sample blood in some locations. There's no refrigeration. You don't want it as a fluid. So we get these blood-soaked filter papers, and we're validating them for use for mercury analysis. This is our direct mercury analyzer. So here's the blood-soaked filter paper. You just cut the strip off, and it goes right on our direct mercury analyzer. We've shown that this works. So here's normal whole blood, and here's our filter paper. So I'm presenting this to the people who do this kind of analyses here. This might be something you might be interested in monitoring people or animals, is you can use this filter paper whole blood, and y equals x means it was perfect, and here's the slope of 1 indicating that they practically matched perfectly with respect to mercury concentrations. This was in bottlenose dolphins and harbor seals. We repeated the study again in other harbor seals, California sea lions, and elephant seals. So we validated this, and now the agencies in Alaska are using it to monitor blood mercury in a variety of animals. So for feeding ecology and selenium, we've investigated this. For feeding ecology, we look at stable isotopes of carbon and nitrogen. In this case, we take the liquid portion after we soak it in saline, and then we dry that, and we can measure carbon and nitrogen stable isotopes. And again, we looked at dolphins, muskox, and moose. And again, the slopes were very close to 1 and worked out quite well. Selenium analysis, this is one of the ways we do selenium. We took this and digested it through various steps here. And we showed we could get selenium right here, the blue ones. So we're now using the filter papers to address total mercury, selenium, and the ratio of selenium to mercury, which is an important physiological measure, along with these ecological measures of feeding ecology. So we're not just measuring mercury, we're talking about the ecotoxicology of mercury and the potential protective effects of selenium to mercury. So this was an important development. We were funded by the US EPA to do this. And now the agencies in Alaska are using this technique. that's it. There's a lot of people to thank, obviously. There's a lot of work, a lot of students. Oh, and ta-da! That's a stellar sea lion. Thank you. Often people ask what this is. That could potentially be a shark. Shark bite. If you go to California, they're all tore up, right? The pinnipeds from the killer whales and the great whites. We have Greenlandic sharks up there. Yes.
I think as a former student in the lab, and I kind of feel like the most fascinating aspect of this is like being out there and either collecting samples and I don't know, especially in Alaska, right? Like that seems awesome. And I was kind of laughing at the picture that I chose of you on the flyer. For those of you who saw the flyer that I put out on the emails, I was like, yeah, you were fishing or you were doing something, and can you kind of talk about what you were actually doing in the picture?
Well, here's us in the field. This is actually my wife and I with Price Brower, a hunter, a Nupiat hunter. That's a bowhead whale. We're standing on the sea ice. We're 2 miles offshore. Yeah, you really got to trust the ice. So if you see these guys leaving in a hurry, you better start moving. Okay? So that's an example of the field work we did. We worked with the hunters 2 miles offshore on the sea ice. I didn't go out there on my own, obviously. So why am I mentioning that? On the flyer, you might notice that's the hoodie I always wore to the whales. Yeah, because it kind of stinks after a while. I was collecting feces from the whale, and I was very happy. And I think that's why Amy's laughing, but I was collecting whale poop and was just exuberant.
And I thought you had like a fish or something. I didn't really pay much attention to it, and I was like, oh, this is perfect for the flyer.
And it was, I'm collecting whale feces.
But I crossed like that part out. But I didn't know at the time. I showed him the picture we used, and it's like, yeah, you were fishing or something. He's like, I was not fishing.
No. And we're very excited about the work we do, and so even collecting whale poop, you're like, yes, this is so awesome, this is so great. Yeah. And then you saw my wife with the immobilized bear. So we work with agencies that immobilize wildlife. Okay, that's a big operation. That's ships, helicopters. University of Alaska Fairbanks doesn't exactly have all that, right, Justin? We don't. We don't. So we work with a lot of agencies to get access. And then the other important thing is what I just mentioned is people like Price Brower that say, you're welcome at my animal. This is his animal, right? So he's letting you have access to his animal. And the federal agencies give us a permit so we can have access to his animals. So we work with the biologists and the hunters to get access. And some of the stuff we do on our own, but some of these operations are on a huge scale. So when my wife just didn't run out a barrow. Where was that? Didn't I show her?
Yeah. It was like at the beginning.
There it is. Yeah, I mean, we weren't just like hanging out in barrow, hey, let's go grab a bear. No, we worked with the federal biologists and on that, and they were very interested in what we had to offer. For example, new ways of doing health assessments. And this is the truth. And I know if people have to go, it's okay. I understand. Storytelling, right? Yes. So we were trying to convince them it'd be really, really important to get milk samples. Trust me, these federal biologists have to go through a lot to do anything to these bears. And they're like, okay, all right. And then we were talking about how we'd go about doing this, and they were overcomplicating it. And I was like, I just need a syringe barrel, which means you pull the plunger out, right? And a little rubber hose, and we inject them with oxytocin. Hopefully some of you have physiology, and oxytocin stimulates milk letdown, right? And they were like, oh boy, this is really going to complicate our animal welfare review. And I go, not really. And so I was having a little trouble communicating with them. But Katrina Knut, the PhD student that wanted to do this, grew up on a dairy in Minnesota. And so she just started talking like it was a dairy cow. And then they became convinced. And so we were able to then introduce another technique where we got milk samples from them, and then we could look at contaminant transfer from mom to the cub. And we actually ended up writing a paper about it because there was higher PCBs there than we expected in the milk. And so I think some of you might know, because of the people you have in the life sciences department, that we're actually worried about the fetus and the neonate when it comes to some of these contaminants. They're the ones that are being exposed to the highest levels at the most critical stages of their life. So they knew why we wanted to do it. They weren't worried about that. It was just how are the people who manage them going to feel about yet another technique on the bears. And so we ended up doing it, and now it's standard protocol for them. And they collect milk for a variety of reasons now. But so by having us involved, we were able to challenge them on sort of saying, hey, maybe this is worth the effort of you getting it approved to do. Working on these animals is a challenge for those federal biologists. Logistically, and the animal welfare groups watch them very, very closely. They're not allowed to make any mistakes. I think that's very unfortunate that they're put under that great deal of pressure. And it's dangerous. Frank, you been in a helicopter? Yep. Maybe the height of this room you might be at, chasing a bear. That doesn't give the pilot much room for error. There's actually a story, I'm glad I was back at camp, where they were going along, and they were about to dart the bear, and they came up to an ice ridge. The bear bounced off the ice ridge, turned around, and took a swat at the helicopter. Pilot went up, and the biologist went, we're going home. I think because he had to change his pants. I think it's because he had to change his pants. But I've been in situations with wildlife biologists where when they have a bad karma moment, they're like, nope, we're done. We've had this when we worked with bottlenose dolphins in Florida, in this polar bear incident, and with moose. So tell stories. Okay, we were catching moose in a very remote part of Alaska. And normally when you go for a cow moose and her calf, the calf runs off into the willows. Just like, oh, when you're done with mom, we'll get back to roaming around the woods. And so my wife and the area biologist for Fish and Game got out, and they were doing their normal thing. They were going to go get blood samples, fecal samples, put a collar on, grab some hair samples. And they're in snow about this deep, so my wife's letting the biologist break the snow like a good sled dog, right? So they're going along, they're halfway between the helicopter and the moose, and all of a sudden the willows just start going like this, and here comes this moose calf, ears pinned all the way back. Both of them turned around and were going to run back to the helicopter, not in snow that deep. So luckily the helicopter pilot had not turned off the helicopter yet, and he went straight up and went between them and the moose calf. And while they processed mom, he kept pushing the calf away with the helicopter. So animals will surprise you every now and then. But my wife was like, she turned around and went to run back to the helicopter. She was like, I'm dead. So working with wildlife has its moments of fear and terror. And often we bring it upon ourselves, but every now and then they challenge us. So it is really exciting work. Is that what you wanted me to get at? That we do a lot of field work? My best part is working with fish, because you can do a lot with fish. And fish are actually one of the best integrators of marine and aquatic systems. So we really like doing a lot of work with fish. But most people like the furry things, furry warm things.
Well,
Any questions or anything else for me to dwell on?
If there are any questions, go ahead and ask them. Or I know Todd has agreed if anyone's interested in carrying on some more conversation and just talking more. He isn't in any big rush to leave back to Missoula.
How long does it take to get to Missoula? 4 or 5 hours? No, I'm overnighting in Missoula, so no great rush. Yes, sir.
I understand, I think that Alaska has a state-funded hair sample for mercury program.
That's correct.
How effective is that, and what are the general results from that?
Okay. It's called the Hair Biomonitoring Program, and initially it was for women who are pregnant. and then expanded into women of childbearing age. So they're trying to expand the population they're looking at, but that's typically who they're looking at. And usually a physician or a nurse will do it for the patient, but people can also submit their own hair samples. So what they do is they're given instructions on how to take the hair sample, and they submit it to the state lab that has a mercury analyzer, and they will analyze that, and we hope they get to send the data back to a practitioner or nurse so that they can help interpret the data. So that's the ideal situation. So that data goes back to that person, and then the individual's informed about their mercury status. So the cutoff level for an intervention is 5 parts per million. Anything below 5 parts per million, the state won't follow up or contact anyone. And many, like over 95% of the people are well below that 5 part per million level. For those that are at the 5 part per million level and higher, the state will do a consultation to say, okay, what is it you do in your lifestyle, like eating, what do you do for a job, to try and help explain the mercury concentration. So when they do those follow-ups, they're finding out that it's typically people who eat northern pike and eat liver and or kidney from marine mammals. So that's been the consistent, and that's only been a few, like a handful of people that have been above 5 parts per million. None of them have been at really critically high levels. There was one individual who had this outrageously high number, and they followed up with them, and they had been to Africa, and they had had these whitening treatments. Yes. They use high mercury in some hair and skin products, and she's like, excuse me? And like, yeah, that explains it. You went and had some kind of cosmetic treatment that was actually very high levels of mercury. And the work we've been doing in Mexico, we're finding out that people who work in dentist's office and they're mixing and preparing amalgams every day are the ones who have high mercury levels. So the follow-up's really important because some of the times you find out it's cosmetic or occupational. No, if it has to be the mercury-based amalgam. Dentists now are using, a lot of dentists in the United States are now using other types of polymers, I understand. Am I right? I hope.
Yes.
Okay. So, but some parts of the world,
It's not allowed anymore.
some places can still use it. Not recommended. But some parts of the world are still using the mercury-based amalgams. So that's the program and how it works. And it's been very reassuring because some people come out and say, oh, this has high mercury, that has high mercury. And then we can always go back to that data and say, yeah, but people tend to have low mercury exposure. And we're actually doing research on that now where we're going to go to certain communities and intensify the hair sampling and hair monitoring. And we're also going to introduce the use of carbon and nitrogen stable isotopes so that when we do the diet survey, we can see how closely the diet survey they give us relates to the chemistry. And I don't mean to be mean about people, but I'm a person too. But chemistry doesn't lie. So we can tell from the chemistry if they have a strong fish or marine signature or not. And so that has helped us fine-tune our interpretation of their mercury exposure. And in Mexico, that played out where these couple occupational exposures, they weren't eating much fish, but they had the mercury levels of a high fish consumer. Looked at the stable isotopes, nope, they're not eating very much fish. There must be another reason. And then when they broke open the records, right, we do it blind. When we looked at the records, then we found out they were dental hygienists. So I think hair monitoring is essential. I think people who just base fish advice on the consumption of fish, just based on the mercury levels in fish, that's only half the story. I think you really need to look at the population who integrates all that into their actual exposure. I think that's really important. I'm not saying we're doing it right in Alaska, but I like it that we're doing both. It really helps us interpret things a little better. Do you have fish consumption issues in Montana?
Sure.
I thought you did. And so I would recommend a combination of hair monitoring with monitoring of fish. The other thing we're doing, while I'm on a spiel here, is we've decided that we also need to look at processed foods. That in Alaska, they love to abuse their fish foods, right? I mean, they dry them, they smoke. It's like take a boot, jump on them, and yeah, that's how you eat your fish. Jesse knows, they smoke them, they dry them, they ferment them. What else? They bake them, they steam them, they eat them raw. If there's any way to process a fish and eat it, they do it in Alaska. Well, what we found was that greatly changed the concentrations of the contaminants and nutrients. If it's a lipophilic nutrient, and they let the oils drip out, those contaminants follow the oils. If it's something like mercury that's protein bound, protein associated, and they dry the muscle, that concentrates it. So we found that recognizing how people process their foods to eat is really important. And in the Great Lakes area, I know Doug works with people in the Great Lakes, they actually encourage them to allow the oils to drip out of the fish to reduce the levels of PCBs in what they're going to eat. I remember that. And so some people have used it strategically. So in Alaska, we've taken a closer look at how people actually eat the fish. We call it end-of-the-fork analysis. We don't literally go in and strip it off their fork. That would be kind of rude. But I think you get the point.
It'd be very funny.
Well, we have images and cartoons that students like to show where we steal people's food. Right? And there's one where you see the hand go by with the food, and the person's like, because they just stole it off their fork. But try to make the point. But we found out that's really important because if you take like the raw fish total mercury concentration and say, oh, there's this much per amount of fish they eat, well, when they go out to do the surveys and people say, oh, I eat this much dried fish, that misrepresents it, right? Because if I eat a half a kilo of dried fish, that's very different than a half a kilo of wet fish. Thank you. I know you got to run to your meeting.
Thank you.
Bye. So I think if people are going to investigate this, they need to take a closer look at what people actually eat.
That's part of our problem that we found here, though, that Doug found, is that he did a bunch of studies and then found nobody's eating fish.
Yeah, he told me that.
So, yeah.
And so my campaign here would be, oh my gosh, you need to eat fish.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that's culturally correct or not.
Well, yeah, we actually, we applied for a grant, and Tony, I don't know if he's in here, was a part of that, a community-based project to tie the science and that together, and we weren't funded. Because it was too complicated. Yeah, that's
Well,
where our
at the
problem
stage
is.
you're at right now, eating fish is very important.
Yeah.
What we're saying is the nutrients in fish, the pediatricians in Alaska, despite all the stuff I just talked about, are encouraging the consumption of fish because they know it's important for fetal development, especially of the brain. And last thing they want is people going off fish, especially when they're pregnant and lactating. And so some of my best allies are pediatricians, and they actually write grants with me. And because they're pediatricians, we have access to different sources of funds that way. So it's a very good point. So encouraging fish consumption is essential in Alaska. Who was I talking to? One of you two. We were talking about reaching that threshold of where they stop eating enough fish, diabetes will outbreak. Yeah. So
Because I was asking you if you had diabetes patients in your community,
Right.
and if you put them back on their
Right.
traditional diet, if it reverses.
That's right. And so what the pediatricians are saying and the physicians are saying in Alaska is if people drop their fish consumption to a certain level because of their current dietary practices of drinking soda, eating processed carbohydrates, lack of exercise, that when that protection of eating fish reaches a certain level, we're going to have an actual outbreak of diabetes like you've seen on reservations here in the lower 48. And we're really trying to get the word out that this will be awful, that when that protection goes away, it will be an epidemic of diabetes. Oh, I'm talking about type 2, by the way, diabetes type 2. So we're trying to make sure people understand there's a balance to all this, that you don't want to leave your traditional diet when we already know it's beneficial. And in a place like this, I would say if they had a history of eating fish, yeah, really important to try and get that back. Because for neonatal development, protection from diabetes, yeah, it's really important. Yep. And then like an epidemiologist I work with, he always starts every talk off with smoking. Like, in the context of smoking, this means nothing. We have real problems in rural Alaska with smoking. Very, very prevalent. And so, if I was to put smoking data up here and disease outcomes.
Commercial cigarette.
Yeah, tobacco. Yeah. And they also have strange ways of chewing it, too. If I put the diseases from tobacco use up here, this would become insignificant. So we have a tobacco problem in rural Alaska, both smoking and chewing.
How do you chew it in strange ways?
Did you ever hear of ICMIC? There's something called ICMIC that in northwestern Alaska they do. They take regular chewing tobacco and then they ash willow leaves. They combine it together. It alters the pH of the product so that it's absorbed much more readily and quickly, and they get a nicotine rush. Unfortunately, ICMIC was then used.
That's why I'm laughing. She's the one that would ask that question.
Yeah, and so it changes the bioavailability of the nicotine, and so I don't know how it became a traditional use because obviously it was introduced from whalers, Western contact. It was then used for babies who were teething because it soothed their. Yeah, and so there's a cultural identification with this now in some parts of northwestern Alaska. And when some of the scientists went out there, the children were showing nicotine poisoning signs, the tremoring and all that. So we have a real tobacco issue. That's why I meant what you would consider non-traditional uses of tobacco. Because when whalers showed up, it was just raw tobacco. So people were being imaginative in how they would use it. Yeah. So if I was to say, I'm going to have my career based on the most important diseases in Alaska, it would start with alcohol, tobacco, and then domestic violence. And so this stuff, I always try to put in the appropriate context. That what we're struggling with in Alaska, this is further down on the list. But you see the cultural implications, and so we are trying to help there.
But in the One Health scheme, you could integrate alcoholism as well.
We do when we work with the epidemiologists, because if they maintain their subsistence lifestyle and their culture, they're less likely to turn to alcohol. Yeah, especially the males. There's been a lot of studies that the males are really the most vulnerable in these communities because they're the most likely to lose their identity. As the hunter-gatherer provider, right? If everything goes to a store-bought system, cash system, as opposed to a harvesting system, the males are the ones who lose their role in the community. And when I was in Barrow, I noticed it was these whaling captains, they called them. They were the premier people in the community. They were the go-to people in the community. They shared all their whale meat they got with the community. And so there you had that intact. That like hunter is the provider, is the icon. But we knew with other communities that had gotten away from subsistence activities, that role for the male was gone. It might be a mayor or something. But clearly that's very different. So yeah, by saying maintain your subsistence lifestyle, we keep that intact. The sociologists tell us that's what, then the anthropologists say we have to keep that intact for the mental well-being of the community. Yep. So it does tie in with that. That's where I put socioculture and exercise. There's more to harvesting animals and plants than just eating them. There's a lot of community activity that goes along with that. Whaling is year-round in these communities. They're either preparing for whaling, or they're doing whaling, or they're finishing up for whaling. I think you can imagine that when you get a 50-foot bowhead whale, that's 50 tons or more of whale, you just don't throw it in the freezer, right? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of processing and sharing and things that have to happen. So this whole whaling activity really is over a calendar year. And they make skin boats. And so that's from bearded seal or walrus. And so when they hunt those animals, they'll eat the meat, and then they take the hides, and then they have to prepare them to put them on the wood frames that they go whaling in. So that's why keeping this intact is really important, because something like that is year-round. It's not just going out and getting the whale, is, I guess, what I'm trying to say. Really, really important stuff for those people. I know most students are gone, but I mean, that was something that I never dreamed I would be able to get to do. And wow, when that opportunity came up, man, absolutely fascinating. My whole family was involved with that. That's the cool thing about it. That was really neat.